YouTube links for the recordings of the previous webinars if you weren't able to make those. This is also where you can still register for our final talk later on today at 3 p.m. Eastern, where we will hear from the Oregon Department of Agriculture, some updates and management strategies going on over there. But today we are so excited to welcome Arvind Vasudevan and Chris MacQuarrie from up in Canada. And they are going to talk to us today about emerald ash borer. The title of their presentations being The Tiny Green Menace in the Great White North. All of the talks are around 40 minutes each, which leaves ample time for question and answer. So if you do have a question throughout the talk, please pop it into the Q&A feature. That'll be a little bit easier than us trying to work through all the different chats. So we can streamline that a little bit. And if you'd rather verbally ask your question, you can use the little raise your hand feature, and we will also try to get to you at the end. I should be able to go in and manually be able to unmute you. So that is an option as well. All of these, as I mentioned, are recorded. So this is kind of my own cue to myself to record. I'm going to stop sharing.
Oh, Laurel, I did already start the recording.
Oh, beautiful. Lee, you're way ahead of me. Perfect. So we are recording and ready to go. So Arvind, you, I believe, are up first if you want to share your screen and take it away.
Hello, everyone. So hopefully you're able to see my screen, and thanks, Lee and Laurel, for.
Not quite able to see your screen yet. Yep, we're just seeing you still, which is great. But you might want us to be able to see your slides.
Okay, this should work now, I think now.
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Maybe the first time I didn't click through, so. Thanks, Laurel. Okay, hello, everyone. My name is Arvind Vasudevan. I work as a senior specialist with the CFIA. And today we are going to, myself and Chris MacQuarrie are going to give you a presentation on the Tiny Green Menace, EAB, an update. So I'm going to do the historical and current situation next steps, and Chris is going to do part 2 of the presentation where he's going to focus on some of his research projects, focusing on detections and the EAB cold tolerance aspects. So moving on. So the presentation outline, like I mentioned, I'm going to talk about the historical update, current situation, regulatory status, and the potential future regulatory scenarios for Canada, and some of the conclusions and next steps that we are planning to do. So EAB is currently present in 6 provinces in Canada, and the most recent being Vancouver and the province of British Columbia. But then before we get to Vancouver, let's look at the historical aspects, like how it all started for us in Canada, in Ontario. So going back to 2002, 2003, it was first detected in Detroit, and also Detroit, Michigan, and also in Windsor, Ontario, right across the border. And initially, as we did not know much, we thought we could probably do an ash exclusion zone. We kind of like cut a bunch of trees and hoping that it wouldn't kind of like cross that barrier. But it just so happened it had already crossed the barrier. And so we were in it for the long haul with this particular pest. So we kind of like created the first regulated area in 2003. And then subsequently, things started to grow from there. And it was kind of like constant monitoring and mentioning and monitoring. And then also looking at the strategy. Initially, we kind of like thought eradication might be an option, but then slowly and very soon we realized that slow the spread might be an option that we will have to kind of like work with until we found other tools that could help us in the situation. So, and how did we go about it? Under the Plant Protection Act, we have a number of options. One of them is prohibition of movement, where we issue notices. So that is how we started out. We started issuing notices of prohibitions. And then the next step is issuing a ministerial order whereby an order is created where a regulatory zone is kind of like established for a regulated pest in Canada. So that was the process that we kind of like adopted early on. So we continued to do the ministerial orders for a number of years between 2003 and 2006. It did continue to grow. And as you can see, it started spreading. And then going up to, sorry, one slide over, 2008 is when it kind of like got into one of our major metro areas in the Toronto region in 2008. And then in 2009, it hit us here in Ottawa. And then you also see a little bit of it making an appearance in Quebec. So that was in 2009. And then as you can see, it continued to grow within the Toronto region and then in Ottawa as well. And 2011 or 2012, it spread into Montreal and then also went up into the Manitoulin Islands that you see here. And then in 2013, 2014, we kind of like were managing these patchwork of regulated areas. So we needed something bigger to manage, and because it was hard for movement of regulated articles. And when I talk about regulated articles, it's anything concerned with ash. Could be ash logs, ash nursery stock, and anything ash with bark was a regulated product. And moving, and of course, all firewood was also included. So movement of these products kind of like became difficult, and so we had to rethink our strategy in 2013, 2014, about 15 years into managing this pest. So we consulted about it, and we kind of like had workshops in the Toronto region and consulted with both the provinces of Ontario and Quebec. And we kind of like went with an extended regulated area, which encompasses all of Southern Ontario and almost all parts of Southern Quebec, including the metro regions of Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa. So then after that, for a couple of years, it was quiet. And then in 2017, we again saw an upsurge in expansion of the EAB regulated areas. We found them in Sault Ste. Marie, and then we also found it in the city of Winnipeg in 2017 and Thunder Bay. And then there was detections in Quebec City as well. And as you know, there's a lot of traffic between Montreal and Quebec City, and there were a number of counties or MRCs, as they call them in Quebec, that were unregulated. And so we had to regulate that particular part as well. So we went through a second phase of expanded regulated areas, going all the way from Montreal into Quebec City and all those MRCs in between. Then in 2018, it entered New Brunswick, and this was the first county that was regulated in New Brunswick, Madawaska County. And then right after, in 2019, Halifax, the metro region of Halifax kind of like got infested. And then for a few more MRCs were added in the Quebec region as well in 2019. And then the COVID pandemic hit, and our surveys were kind of like all over the place for a bit. And in 2020, we did notice that there was a bunch of counties again infested in New Brunswick. So we again took that expanded county approach and regulated all of the counties in New Brunswick that straddle the Highway 1 corridor. There's a major highway running across New Brunswick into Atlantic Canada. So we kind of like had to do that highway again for ease of regulatory movement of regulated products. And that leads us to 2024. The most recent addition you can see in the next slide. There was one other county that was added, Témiscamingue in Western Quebec, and the Gaspé Peninsula, the counties there that were added as well. So now the regulated area kind of like covers almost the southern parts of the provinces of Ontario and Quebec and much of New Brunswick and into Nova Scotia. Interestingly, things did not change much in Thunder Bay and in Winnipeg. And that is what Chris is going to be talking about in his talk about how EAB is behaving in Winnipeg. It is an interesting situation there. And Thunder Bay is also interesting. It hasn't gone beyond the regulated city, which is the city of Thunder Bay. There was one fine, but then it was 1 kilometer away from the regulated area. So in those kinds of situations, we don't change the regulatory zone. It is kind of considered as a buffer at this point in time. So we are monitoring that one particular tree that was kind of like positive just outside the regulatory area in Thunder Bay. So the current situation as it stands right now, this is our regulated area. And one other thing that is not shown in the map is Vancouver. Vancouver, the situation was also interesting in the sense like in 2023, we kind of like had something what we call determine and term as something called as an interception, whereby we don't have an infested tree or any other live stages. All we found was a live adult. It was reported by an entomologist who kind of like found that right in downtown Vancouver near Canada Place, where there are a lot of trucks and big shows that happen. So there's a lot of movement of people and a lot of movement of articles. So we thought maybe it was probably just an interception, but we did do a lot of surveying. As you can see in the next slide, this is our survey tool that we use, Survey 123. It's a GIS platform whereby we are able to kind of like mark our regulated zones. As you can see, these counties in orange, and also we had initially planned 450 sites, but then we had to hike it up to 529 sites, just because of the Vancouver situation, where we kind of like did a blitz of traps last year, but we did not find anything in Vancouver last year with the interception. So we were kind of like determined it to be an interception at that point in time in 2023. And of course, things changed in 2024, and we kind of like went into something more detailed called as branch sampling, which Chris is going to talk about, and he'll talk a little bit more about the Vancouver detections that happened in 2024. So as you can see, we have only 450 sites planned. And that, if you think about for Canada, is a real small number with the expense that we have to cover. So these numbers are specifically only sites planned by CFIA, but we also do have partners like the provinces and the municipalities that do deploy traps as well. And those kinds of traps are also kind of like included here in some situations, but I'm not sure. I'll have to double check whether they were included. So our catchment area is slightly bigger than what you see in the screen because of the partner involvement, like I mentioned. And another important delineation is whenever we regulate an area, we stop monitoring or surveying within the regulated area, because we kind of like understand that as being infested. So whenever we make these huge regulated areas, we kind of like run into the problems of understanding where the pest is and how the pest is moving. And that is where our partners kind of like come into play, and they kind of like deploy traps and monitor the situation within the regulated zones. So our major partners are the municipalities, because they have the biggest stake with regards to urban trees that are planted and take down and management of those urban trees. So it's in their best interest to kind of like support us in this role. And we support them by providing traps as well. But as you know, the trap isn't super, super effective. It's always kind of like a hit and miss with regards to traps. And that is part of the problem with managing EAB. We are always kind of like behind before we kind of like catch. And it needs to hit a certain population level before we start staying them in traps. And by the time the infestation is pretty far along with regards to EAB. So this gives you an idea as to how we kind of like went about the survey aspects. So then getting into site characterization, this is when, before we do a regulatory decision, we have to do a site characterization survey once we have a detection. And we kind of like analyze the site with regards to what are the potential dispersal pathways, whether there is active logging happening in that area or active movement of warehouses, those kinds of like situations. And we do outreach and training, like I mentioned, with our municipal partners and other stakeholders, and also the provinces. And we do ground-based visual inspections of ash trees within the 500-meter zone of detection, and also a 5-kilometer radius of infested trees. So that gives you an idea as to where the pest is and how widespread a pest is in the particular situation. In the case of Vancouver, that is currently ongoing. And like I mentioned, Chris is going to kind of like touch into those aspects as to the Vancouver detailed information. And that is one of the reasons why we haven't regulated Vancouver yet. Our intent is to probably regulate it at the city level, but we don't know yet. We still have to do our consultations and engagements with the province, the University of British Columbia, and some indigenous lands within the city of Vancouver. That all that needs to be completed. So looking at the current regulatory status and what does it mean, how do we manage it? We kind of like look for entry and domestic movements. Both are kind of like regulated under these aspects. So we have entry requirements for imported ash products, and we also have restrictions on the domestic movement of ash products. We have a directive called as D0308, which outlines the requirements for the domestic movement of regulated articles and the importation of regulated articles from the continental US. Ash imports from off-continent is prohibited unless it is exempt, as it is not permitted to import a pest or a thing that is infested with a pest. So all processed materials that are completely free of bark, of sapwood, and free of pests or signs of living pests that have been subject to conditions or treatments and that have been altered, that have altered the article in a manner to significantly reduce the potential of wood items to provide a habitat for EAB. So those kinds of products are kind of like prohibited. And all products need to be treated or processed in a way that renders them free from EAB. Some examples of exempt articles are sawdust, tool handles, sporting goods, plywoods, veneer, wood pellets, fiber boards, which are processed, and something similar to Oriental strand board. Those kinds of products are not regulated and they are free to move from the regulated area. So at this point in time, we regulate, like I mentioned, both imported ash products as well as restrict domestic movements. And when we say restrict domestic movements, when it's moving from a regulated area to an unregulated area, we kind of like issue something called as movement certificates, which is similar to a phytosanitary certificate that is kind of like under the IPPC, where products kind of like have to come in with the phytosanitary certificate. So movement certificates are domestic phytosanitary certificates that are issued after an inspection, or if they're under a compliance program, the product is known to be free from where it has been processed so that the bark and the sapwood is removed. So there are a number of companies that are under the CFIA EAB compliance program, whereby they adhere to a quality systems manual and regular annual inspections and audits, whereby they are meeting our requirements with regards to movement of regulated products. The same can be said with regards to firewood. Firewood, as you might know, we regulate all of the genera that is associated with firewood, not just ash, but it is a challenging situation. Like not all firewood species are treated the same way. And that is constantly a struggle that we kind of like have to manage with regards to managing firewood. So we are also in the process of updating our firewood directive, and hopefully that will help us in the situation with regards to firewood movement. We are hoping to kind of like come up with a standard for firewood treatment that would be applicable for firewood movement. Even though we do have currently kiln operators that are authorized to certify firewood, there aren't many, and it is not directly managed by the CFIA at this point. So as, excuse me, so looking at the potential for expansion, as you can see, this is a map of EAB, different species of EAB that is present in Eastern North America. And then there is also the Oregon ash that is not mentioned in the map. And its distribution, from what I understand, is from California all the way up into Seattle. And in Canada, we do have populations of Oregon ash. From our discussions with the province, currently they have listed it as unknown, but initially it was kind of like categorized as critically endangered because there were two known populations that have to be verified again. One is in the island of Vancouver, and one is in the mainland just north of the city of Vancouver. So those populations have to be verified, and as you may know, it is at the very extreme range of distribution, this Oregon ash, and it is now kind of like becoming a big threat. It's becoming a big threatened situation because of EAB at this point. So that needs to be managed as well. So based on this, we did have a few lessons learned. Like I mentioned, firewood is the main pathway for the spread, and firewood has been very difficult to restrict, even though we have a lot of outreach material and information that has been provided. It has been a challenge because most of the infestations that we kind of like find have always been related to firewood movement, especially within high population centers. And we also did a study on EAB regulation and its cost, and we did an economic analysis, a cost-benefit analysis, the cost of regulation and its effectiveness. And the study, as you have it on the screen there, it was done by researchers in the Canadian Forest Service. So there, what they mentioned was that even with 10% efficiency, regulations will protect and delay the spread of EAB. And based on their maps, they predicted Western Canada to be infested around 2030, 2035. Well, when I'm talking infested, more expansion, like not just Winnipeg or Vancouver in the situation, more detailed expansion. So there is definitely benefits with regards to EAB regulation, even though it is a little bit of a passive approach. And this report was in contrast to the USDA cost-benefit analysis, which led to the US deregulating EAB and funneling their funds towards more on the biocontrol and other aspects. Probably the reasoning behind and the difference in opinions between these two studies is probably the amount of dollars spent and the value that you get for the dollars that you're spending. I can say definitely Canada does not match the amount of money that the USDA spent with regards to managing things best. So with regards to the relative dollars spent, maybe our regulations are effective in slowing the spread. So in the regulatory space, that is the major maximum control that we have. So we can rethink our regulatory process and see what else we can do with regards to regulation. And then also there is a potential as to whether we can do something more. So we did a workshop in March of this year, and we focused on Eastern Canada. Like I mentioned, there is a difference with regards to how this pest is behaving in Eastern Canada versus Western Canada. So we were looking for something similar to the spongy moth approach, whereby if you are not familiar, spongy moth in Canada is regulated in all of Eastern Canada except Newfoundland and Labrador, whereby all the provinces are regulated for spongy moth. Before we used to do it as the county-based approach, but in Eastern Canada, it's now all provinces except Newfoundland and Labrador. And we kind of like keep the West free and protect the West from spongy moth. So we were thinking maybe that is something that we can think for EAB. Maybe that is one of the options. So we kind of like focused specifically on Eastern Canada and did a workshop in March. It was a 2-day workshop in Moncton in New Brunswick. And we had experts and researchers from the US as well as in Canada and different federal and provincial and municipal and indigenous groups present in at this workshop. And it was kind of like done virtually as well, to enable people to attend if they weren't able to come in person. So we are currently waiting to hear what we heard report from that workshop. And that will probably help us determine our future regulatory scenarios. And I can share with you some of the regulatory scenarios that were discussed at this workshop. So the first one is status quo, which would mean regulate by county by county. And like I mentioned, it's always never only a single county. Since we transitioned over in 2014, 2015, we seem to be doing blocks of counties. We just don't do a county. So that would be the status quo, whereby even in the most recent example that I provided in the Gaspé region in Quebec, there was about 7 or 8 counties that were kind of like done together. So maybe that is still an option. That would be the status quo. And then we could probably regulate it at the provincial level. Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. All of these provinces are currently regulated for EAB. And then this is similar to the Spongy Mata approach, regulate all of Eastern Canada, Ontario to Newfoundland. But this would mean 2 provinces that are currently free from EAB, both islands at this point in time, which is Prince Edward Island and Newfoundland and Labrador, which are free from EAB. So do we want to go down that road? So this was another option that was thrown in. And then the fourth option was stop restricting domestically. We don't do anything domestically, but focus more on restricting imports coming into the country, and do that at the genus level as opposed to the species level for EAB, because all of a sudden there are many agreless species that are unknown and that need protection. And that is what the US is doing currently. It is kind of like having requirements at the border with regards to managing EAB, but then it is done through the genus level, as all agreless is prohibited. And then, of course, the last one is EAB is deregulated in Canada, and I don't think we are there yet, especially with the situation in Western Canada where there's much to be done. And especially because there is a lot of presence of ash present in Western Canada, that we do have these shelter belts in the provinces to protect the prairie snow drifts from happening. There are shelter belts in Manitoba, in Saskatchewan, and even in Edmonton. The city of Edmonton has a huge ash population of trees planted in the urban areas. So it would be catastrophic if it were to kind of like enter there. So there is still parts of provinces in Canada that still need protection. So with regulation, there needs to be something more that can be done. And that is what Chris is going to be talking about. One of the tools that we discussed and we learned a lot from the US is with regards to biocontrol and ash breeding, those kinds of aspects that can be still employed for managing EAB. And with that, I would transition over to Chris to talk about his experiences with research and his most recent expeditions to Vancouver. Over to you, Chris. And I'm guessing we are doing the questions at the very end, right, Laurel? Okay, and I'm going to stop my
Thanks, Arvind.
share.
I'll share when you start or when you stop.
Yes,
Perfect.
if questions would be best at the end, and if people have any questions, probably the easiest way is to put it in the question and answer feature there. But again, we can address hand raised at the end as well.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Hey, Laurel, if you want to give me a thumbs up if the screen's okay, but otherwise
Yep.
I'll get start. Cool. All right. Thanks, Arvind. Okay, so I'm going to talk. So I'm part 2 of this. So my name's Chris MacQuarrie. I'm a research scientist with the Canadian Forest Service. I'm based in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, which, if you know Michigan, I'm at the very tip of the northern peninsula of Michigan. I'm about 40 minutes from Mackinac Island. So that's where I'm geographically located in Canada. We do research in my lab. We do research on sort of risk management of invasive species. So we work a lot on emerald ash borer, more recently on hemlock woolly adelgid. We've done sort of work on population dynamics of EAB, and then somewhat on movement of solid wood packaging material and preventing transmission of EAB to trading partners. So when I was thinking about this talk, I wanted to sort of give you a bit of flavor of what's going on with EAB in Canada, and so I thought I'd talk about our sort of biological control program of EAB in Canada. If you're familiar with the US program, we're certainly an offshoot of that, but I thought I'd give you a little bit of an idea of our context. And then I wanted to talk about our two interesting populations of EAB. Arvind gave a real good summary of kind of the progress of the infestation, and he mentioned those two Western Canadian populations, so one in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and then the one in Vancouver. And so I'm going to talk about both of those and some of the research we've done in Manitoba recently, and then just a little bit of kind of a nitty gritty on the detection delineation of EAB in Vancouver that we worked on with CFIA. So just to talk about the biological control program, I'm assuming since you've come to an EAB seminar, you're a bit familiar with the agents and that they've been released in North America, so going back to the early 2010s. A lot of the research done out of USDA APHIS, folks like Leah Bauer and Xian Duan. We've been doing releases in Canada since about 2012. We work for this project. We work with a lot of partners, a lot of other federal government departments, a lot of folks in the states, a lot of our municipalities and provinces, and a lot of our conservation authorities, which are sort of sub-provincial land management organizations in the province of Ontario, and then other folks across Canada. So I'm just going to give you a real quick rundown of where we've done releases and what we've done releases of. So this is I'm going to show you just a couple maps of Eastern Canada. So starting with Ontario on the left-hand side. I don't know if I have a pointer, but if this far left-hand dot, I live very close to the far left-hand dot. There's Michigan, the mid of Michigan and Ontario. And so these are our release sites for Spatheus gallinae, which is the newest species that's been introduced into Canada. We only started doing releases in 2017. We only do Spatheus gallinae around the same time we had releases approved of Spatheus agrilli, was when it was determined that it didn't really do well in the north. So we've never released it here, and it's certainly never been detected. So so for all these maps, the dots are just colored by the year of first release, and we follow the release protocols from the states, where we do 2 years of releases and then we do follow-ups. So our most recent releases of Spatheus and all of our other agents have been in the Maritime provinces, so New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, and with the most releases in 2023, and we're getting set up to do releases this year, of course. You'll notice in all these maps there's no releases in 2020. COVID, we weren't able to do any releases just because of restrictions on field work and travel in Canada. So this is the releases for Ubis agrilli, and this is our egg parasitoid. This one goes back a little bit further, so back as far as 2015, and you'll notice from the kind of greenish dots that we have our releases down in what we call southwestern Ontario. That's that region between Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, and then Lake Huron to the north. That's kind of where EAB moved through, coming in from Windsor and Detroit, and so that's where our oldest EAB infestations are. We've had Ubius for longer, so we've done releases there for longer, going back to 2015. And then Tetrastigus, which I'm going to guess most people are familiar with. This has been the workhorse of the biological control program with the US and in Canada. We've been doing releases going back to 2013 and all the way into far southwestern Ontario. And I'd have you pay attention just to the blue dots. I'm going to talk about some of those really old release sites and some of our research work that we've been doing in the next couple of slides. And so with the takeaway from all these maps, it's basically the releases in Canada have followed that expanding range of EAB infestation. So in the US, it's kind of been a western spread and a southern spread. In Canada, we've kind of had this spread from southwestern Ontario up through Ontario and Quebec, so kind of in this northeasterly direction, and then into the Maritimes, and that's where we've been doing releases the most. We haven't done any releases in Thunder Bay. We haven't done any releases in Winnipeg, even though those populations have been established for a long time. And Arvind kind of alluded as to why. It's because those populations haven't really grown. They haven't even reached kind of that level where we think there's enough EAB there that we could release enough insects to establish a population. So they've just sort of been sitting there not doing anything, and so that's why they haven't received biological control agents. In terms of establishment, we've looked at some of the establishment. We looked at to see if these species have established. And what we've been able to show is basically in Ontario, Quebec, at almost all of our release sites, we've confirmed establishment of one or more of the species, either mostly Spathius, mostly Tetrasticus. Our plots in the Maritimes, we haven't had a chance to do look for establishment yet. And I just realized that map doesn't show PEI. So I saw somebody who's from Prince Edward Island. I apologize. I don't know what happened there. That's embarrassing. So basically we haven't had a chance to do check establishment of these sites yet. That's work that'll start this year and into next year. For our release program, I'll talk a little about the future of that kind of in the next slides. Some of the research we've been doing in our lab is looking at dispersal of these parasitoids. So we're interested in now that they've established and that we know they're established, at least in Ontario, we're interested in knowing where they're going. And we've been using, this photo kind of illustrates two of the techniques we've been using. So the top there, the bowl is the party bowl, that's the yellow pan trap, fill that with some, ethylene glycol, and the parasitoids come along, land in it, and then you sort through that very tediously to see what kind of see if you're catching the parasitoids. And then that other thing, the stick in the solo cup, is a newer technique developed by Claire Rutledge and Gian Duan that is kind of a sentinel bolt. So that bolt has been artificially infested with EAB in the lab, and we take it out to the field, and you can actually get Tetrasticus to attack that. And we started messing around with that a bit last year just to see if we can get it to work. And I'll talk a little bit about both the work we've done with both these methods. So starting in 2018, 2019, we ran a network of traps around our oldest and most established release sites in southwestern Ontario. So that's the map on the right. And what we did for a summer is we ran those yellow pan traps all through that area and at different distances from our release sites, trying to figure out how far were we getting establishment. And what you can see from those dots, the red dots, is that's where we had establishment. We were able to collect parasitoids at those distances, and that's out to about 20 kilometers. And then we repeated that kind of pan trapping in the Algoma region, so up in northwestern Ontario where I am, near our lab in Sault Ste. Marie, looking at dispersal from our one release site in the region on the south, that's the Star on the southern end of St. Joseph Island. And what we see is we have dispersal from that one release site into different parts of the mainland in this area. So we're seeing pretty good dispersal over a couple of years. And when we look at dispersal rates from these sites, are kind of on par, a little bit quicker than what we're seeing with dispersal by Tetrasticus in the US. And this is all data on Tetrasticus. So last year, like I said, we got messing around with these mini bolts. And so what we did is we set up some research plots in the Algoma region in areas that we knew we had Tetrasticus from our previous surveys. And we're looking to see, could we get these to work? So we set these bolts up with the insect rearing facility here at GLFC that grows all of our parasitoids for our Canadian Biological Control Program, had them artificially infest our bolts with EAB, and then we set them out over 4 periods at these sites over the summer last year. And then you set them out for 2 weeks, bring them back to the lab, see if any Tetrasticus or even Spathius emerge, and then dissect them. And so you get a count of adult parasitoids emerging, and then you also get a count of larval parasitism. And so when we do that, what we find is we sort of just did counts, raw counts. And on the left-hand side here, we see the 4 times we put out bolts for 2 weeks. And you'll notice those dates kind of overlap, so that we had bolts in the field for 2 weeks in overlapping period. And so what we see is we sort of had a peak of larvae collecting Tetrasticus larvae kind of end of July, end of July there, and decreasing into August. And then for adults, we sort of got the most adults kind of the same period. It was kind of peak from a couple of our sites, from that late July collection. So that tells us, that this works. We were able to get it we were quite happy with the results that we got as a trial. And then our plan for next year is to deploy these kind of over a larger network in Southern Ontario and into Quebec, and see how far we're getting dispersal and hopefully impact of these parasitoids. And then maybe really, combining this with some of the techniques for detecting ubius and seeing, where are these parasitoids going within that matrix, that landscape matrix in Southern Ontario, so that we know what kind of impact of the parasitoids are having on our populations and are we contributing to control. So in terms of what's next for us in Canada, we're going to continue our release program. Like I said, we have our releases scheduled for this year. They'll be mostly finishing up these releases in the Maritimes and then adding a couple sites in Quebec, near Quebec City, and working with one of the First Nations there to do some releases on their site. I guess talked about what we want to keep working on, looking at dispersal range and impact. That's kind of the research question that I'm the most interested in, is now that we've done over 10 years of these releases in Canada, what impact are we having on those EAB populations, and are we seeing regenerating ash? And then what we're hoping to do, finally, this has kind of been a long delayed project, is move our biocontrol program from one that's sort of being led by the CFS to one that's being led by our cooperators. So moving to more of a US model, where we're just sort of producing agents and facilitating the import from the States, where we bring in Spatheus. But our cooperators are the ones responsible for finding those release sites, doing the site assessments, actually doing the releases, and then sort of reporting back on whether that's successful or not. Up to this point, we've been doing that, and it's been a fairly heavy lift. And so we were hoping to kind of transition back to more of a research role and let our cooperators take on the kind of operational side of the program. So with that, I'm just going to transition a bit to talking about sort of our status and research on EAB in Winnipeg. And for this bit, and for the next bit, I want to just acknowledge one of my collaborators, and this is Troy Komodo, who is with CFIA in Vancouver, BC. And if you're Canadian, he's also known as the guy on the CFIA slide. So if you saw Arvind's presentation, they has Troy, and it's just Troy holding, I think it's Asian longhorn beetle. So he's sort of Canadian famous amongst plant protection folks, that he's the guy in the CFIA slide. So just a very quick rundown on EAB in Winnipeg. Arvind covered this a bit. So it was first detected in 2017. The city and the Food Inspection Agency followed up with an extensive branch sampling and trapping survey afterwards. The city did a lot of branch sampling around the infestation back in 2017, 2018. There were no further detections aside from like one beetle on a trap that was about one click away from that initial find. We did some work on this population sort of around pandemic, and we published a paper in 2022 with Megan Dewell out of Brent Sinclair's lab that basically showed this is the most cold tolerant population in North America. But prior to this, we thought EAB could do about -30. We showed that EAB in Winnipeg can do about -50, right? So that kind of removed that kind of climate barrier to EAB in terms of where it could spread. So that brings, at least from a Canadian perspective, all of Western Canada kind of into a bubble that where EAB can survive. So lots of ash in Edmonton. Edmonton gets very cold, but not cold enough for EAB. And we think some of that might have to do with sort of plasticity and EAB's response to cold, and how it can sort of, determine what the winter is going to be like, how, where it's established, and kind of get itself ready by producing those cryoprotectants. But what we have noticed is that EAB population in Winnipeg really hasn't been doing anything. It hasn't been behaving like our other populations in Southern Ontario. And in collaboration with the city and the CFIA, we were kind of interested in knowing like what the heck's going on. Why has this not been doing what we think it should be doing? So we started with just a trapping survey in 2023 to look at its present range. Like we wanted to know, where is this in Winnipeg? So that's what we did. And this was all using the green lingering funnel traps baited with the two-part lure. And we used about 50 traps for this. So this is just a map of Winnipeg and the not Archwood, the neighborhood in Winnipeg where the EAB was first found on Cote Street. And so this, excuse me. And so what we did is we wanted to establish a trapping network. So this is a map, shows all of the ash in that kind of general area that were suitable for trapping. And we wanted to see, can we put traps out kind of around this infestation to get an idea just to delineate it. So we did that with some JS, just put this kind of, radius of 100 meters out from there to figure out where we wanted to put traps. And then we deployed our traps. We basically started on Cote Street in the center of that circle and moved outwards, right? Until basically we ran out of traps. And from that network, then we trapped all last summer. There were 4 collections. We were working with a contractor, and these were kind of used John Sweeney's kind of modified protocol. So these were traps high up in the canopy, on the south side. So kind of the best possible conditions to trap EAB. And the result of all that was we found 12 EAB from 8 traps over 3 collection periods. And the farthest out trap is about 500. The farthest out insect that we found from Cote Street, which is that initial detection, was about 500 meters. And so if you just do kind of a raw dispersal estimate over the the time since it was first detected in Winnipeg, that's about 80 meters per year. That's super slow. That is way slower than I think just about anywhere in North America in terms of dispersal, except maybe for Thunder Bay. So that's kind of, I mean, it was definitely further than the folks in Winnipeg thought, but nowhere near as far as we would have expected based on what we know from other populations. And so our next steps is we want to follow this up in 2024 at a small number of sites. We don't have quite the same resources this year as we did last year, but what we were able to do is get some funding from the Food Inspection Agency, and get a graduate student at the University of Winnipeg with Richard Westwood to look at that phenology range and dispersal within Winnipeg. So we're going to use a combination of branch sampling and traps, and then also the trap tree technique from Deb McCullough in Michigan, a lot kind of in this waterway, this river that runs through Winnipeg, looking at where can we pick up EAB, and what is this phenology like? Is it 1 or 2 years? And we think is maybe that the lack of that spread might have to do with the predominance of a 2-year life cycle, making that development really slow, and that spread really slow. And that just hopefully give us some tools and some idea of how EAB might behave in Western Canada. So if and when we find it in those other Western Canadian communities, we know what to do. So just keeping an eye on the time, I will go very quickly through EAB in Vancouver. Arvind kind of already alluded to this. It was detected in 2023 by kind of an amateur fellow who was sitting outside BC Place and had an adult EAB run into him. And he figured out what he had and reported it. And so CFI followed up with a trap survey. It was a little bit late in the season for traps, based on when it was first reported. So that they didn't detect it wasn't super surprising. It was kind of past the very end of the flight period. And because of that, there were no further detections. So with some back and forth with Troy, we initiated a cooperative branch sampling survey in 2023. So we were out there this March looking at detecting and delineating EAB. And for that, we used, there's 2 techniques. We based on the branch sampling method developed by Krista Ryle and John Turgeon and Jeff Fidgen. Basically, this is just two branches, mid-crown branches out of an ash tree, and you peel it to look for EAB larvae. And then using the kind of survey grid technique that was used in Canada as part of the detection and eradication effort for Asian longhorn beetle. And this is John Turgeon's work. So what we did is we started with a map of Vancouver. So if you're kind of familiar with Vancouver, the big green patch there with the 99 in the middle of it, that's Stanley Park. The downtown Vancouver just to the bottom and the right of that. And then the orange dot is the kind of the rough area of the first detection. So this is right downtown Vancouver. This is not kind of where we typically detect EAB. This is not a campground. This isn't sort of a suburban neighborhood with lots of campers and stuff. So and so what we did is began with this map of where we knew EAB was found, and then we overlaid a kind of a 2-kilometer grid. So these are hexagons that are about approximately 2 kilometers in diameter. And then on top of that, we overlaid Vancouver's tree inventory. So I've just zoomed in here a little bit. Vancouver has about 7,000 street ash trees in its inventory, all sorts of different species, all of them introduced, and native species from Europe and from Asia. I'm not showing the entire inventory here. This is just in the neighborhoods we are interested in. And then from that, we went and selected our sample trees. And then we sampled within a couple of these grids over the course of a week. We looked at trying to take about 5 trees per cell and then 2 branches per tree. We oversampled in some of the cells based on what we found. We also, excuse me, and then there's also some kind of opportunistic sampling whenever we sort of saw an ash tree. And so this is just some photos of our sampling work. So that we have a crew from the Pacific Forestry Center that came out and joined us. That's Vince and Esme, and then our crew, Megan in the blue jacket from our lab here, and then a couple of the CFIA inspectors came out and gave us a hand. And we worked in the city of Vancouver. We loaned us a bucket truck because some of these trees were kind of big. And I just would add that this is park trees that we were sampling in the city park trees at the time we were doing the survey. That wasn't in the inventory, but we knew these parks had ash trees. So we were also kind of opportunistically sampling in there. And then this is just Megan demonstrating the branch sampling technique. The city of Vancouver was nice enough to give us some space in their Stanley Park yard, right next to where the horses leave for the tours of Stanley Park, which is kind of cool. The horses would go clopping by every couple hours. And so within 24 hours, we had found the first emerald ash borer. So these are just kind of our branch samples in that lab. This is Esme demonstrating the peeling technique, and then kind of classic EAB gallery, right? That's kind of like, photo, that's, if you wanted to show a picture of an EAB gallery, that's the one you're going to choose, because that's exactly, they never look like that until you want to take a nice picture. And then within about 24 hours, I think, of taking our first sample, we found it. So this is Adela, works with CFIA, and she was the lucky winner of the Find the First EAB prize. And so that's it circled there. That's the first EAB larva found in Winnipeg in one of these trees from Strathcona Park. So very small insect. The rule is we have to submit to CFIA to confirm the identity. So what we actually did was cut that chunk of log out, because we were worried if we tried to pull that bug out, we were going to destroy it. We shipped the whole thing off to Ottawa, and it was confirmed as being EAB. So there's EAB in Winnipeg and in Vancouver. Over the course of the next couple of days, we finished off our sampling. We had positive detections of EAB in 5 trees from branch samples at 2 distinct sites. So on the right there, those dots, that's Strathcona Park. We collected EAB there. That was kind of our first set of samples, and then also along the False Creek Inlet there near BC Place, where we detected some of those trees. There, Troy did some additional follow-up surveys after we left, and it's continued to do so, and he's found additional sites, including one at it's called Andy Livingston Park, which is very near where that adult beetle was first reported. Found 4 heavily infested trees, one of which somebody had taken an axe to for some reason. Like all of this you see was not created by CFI. Was just Troy. This is how Troy found the tree. Somebody had been along and did all this work, this damage to the tree. But heavily infested trees, that obviously been attacked by EAB for many years. And so what's going on now is some of that continuing that detection and delimitation work, trying to figure out where EAB is in the city. So our follow-up surveys are going to continue by the CFIA. We're certainly interested in the range and dispersal impacts of Vancouver and BC. These are all open questions. Certainly, if somebody's interested in working on EAB in BC, these are questions that could be answered. We don't really know how it's going to behave in this maritime climate. We don't know how it's going to behave in some of these tree species that are there. They're not ones that we have in eastern Canada. And basically, and how it got to Vancouver, I think, is a really interesting question, because it's this kind of typical ground zero is not where we usually find EAB. So like, how did it get to Vancouver, and how was it able to establish there in this kind of really urbanized neighborhood? So there's really interesting research questions, I think, to be answered in EAB in Vancouver to tell us a bit more about EAB. So with that, I'll finish. I hope I left you some time for questions. I apologize for taking too long, but yeah, that's the end. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much, Arvind and Chris. That was awesome. And we do still have time for questions. So I'm gonna pop into the Q&A here and just read off the first one. We have Patrick Porter. How many people, full-time equivalents, has CFIA tasked to work on EAB? And he mentions that he's worked with some folks in the CFIA, and he knows that you're stretched pretty thin.
Yes, the amount of EAB, the amount of FTE that has been invested in EAB control is kind of like varied over the years. Like initially during 2002, 2003, 2007, they were upwards to up to 22 to 30, almost 30 FTEs that were involved with EAB management. But in recent years, going back to 2013 to 2015, that kind of like data, and even in more recent ones, I think it is closer to more like 3.5 to 4 FTEs. So that is basically inspectors that do part of their job with regards to EAB, because they kind of like manage. They're mostly, we kind of like have food, animal, and plant inspectors. And when push comes to shove, we might move people from the food or animal to the plant realm. But usually within the plant realm, it's plant inspectors. They kind of like work within their commodity lines. And they just don't, again, focus only on EAB. They need to focus on other pests that we manage as well, like oak wilt, HWA, and myriad other pests that we kind of like have to deal with. So based on that calculations, I think it is closer to 4 FTEs across Canada, is our guess at this point.
Great. I'm also gonna call on Katie, who has had her hand patiently raised this whole time. Katie Parker, you should be able to take yourself off mute and ask your question. Do we still have Katie here? Maybe that was a mistake. Okay, Katie, if something's going wrong and you can't take yourself off mute or something, just put your question in the Q&A, please. Okay, I'm gonna get to the other question in the Q&A. So from Brett McDonald, we have, thanks for the update in Winnipeg. I did spatial modeling and degree day modeling for EAB in Winnipeg. My question is, if the Winnipeg population of EAB is the most cold tolerant, why do you think EAB's population hasn't grown or really been prevalent in Winnipeg since its discovery in 2017?
Yeah, so my hypothesis on that one is that it's developmental time. I have a PhD student who's working on developing developmental rates for EAB, under lab conditions. And what his findings have shown and what we think is going on in Winnipeg is that the population might just get, development starts very late in the season. So the adults emerge later than in other places. The eggs, it takes time for them to maturation, feed, and lay eggs. And by that time that happens, it's very late in the season. And so you have populations that are, they're just maybe completing a couple larval instars. And so that means they're into a 2-year life cycle automatically. And the minute you're kind of into a 2-year life cycle, it just stretches out the amount of time it takes that population to grow because it can't kill trees as fast and it can't reproduce as fast. And so you just have much slower population growth. And that would align with Thunder Bay. Like Thunder Bay is a little bit further south, but it has a cooler climate than other parts of it. It's sort of similar to Winnipeg. So that would sort of suggest that's what's going on there, that it's just this really long developmental time. And what we're hoping that the student next year can get an idea of phenology and look at like what is a developmental stage of EAB in Winnipeg at different times of the year after a season of growth and kind of these artificially damaged trees. So that's one of the questions we're interested in.
Excellent. Also, Chris, I heard you mention during your talk that you worked with Megan Dool on the cold tolerance, and she actually gave a talk last year for our EAB Awareness Week. So if anyone's interested in learning more about that work, that is recorded on our YouTube channel, and it's a previous EAB Week landing page. And actually, I'll find that while you're answering our next question, which is from Lee. She says, will there be DNA comparative testing of the Vancouver EABs in an effort to see if any origin information could be gathered? Example, North America infestation, Europe infestation, Asian source populations.
So the question is yes. Like, so we sent, so that initial EAB larva and some of the other ones we found went off to CFI's lab in Ottawa to Aaron Campbell, who's a molecular insect geneticist, who's been looking at a bunch of kind of genetic questions around EAB, some to do with cold tolerance and adaptation. And then so that's some of the stuff Aaron's looked at. And I don't know if we have the tools to be able to say, the question I would, is it another introduction versus where it came from in North America? I'm not sure that's one thing she's looking at, but it was definitely sent for typing. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, because Vancouver is one of the largest ports for Canadian international commerce, if it actually could have been from the source population in Asia, or potentially even from some of the, it seems less likely it would be part of the European infestation, but it's possible. So it would just be really interesting, because Vancouver does seem to be such an unusual case due to the location and the nature of that infestation, to see, if it was actually direct from a different Asian source population. That'd be fascinating.
Yeah, so you've got like a big port there. There's also a big rail terminus. Right. So, and then there's the work out of Minnesota that shows they will move along rail corridors, right? So
there's tremendous number of possibilities, and that's why I think it's an interesting question. I would guess it's actually probably coming in either by tourism or by rail, if I had to guess, because the population pressure from both the Canadian infestation and the American infestation would be so high. But it would be interesting to find out.
Yep. It's certainly a question for some of our colleagues on the coast. So.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, so that hits the hour, but we do have one more question. If Chris and Arvind, are you able to stick around for like another minute to answer it real quick?
Sure.
Okay, wonderful. We have a question from Jake, who says, do you think that a 2-year life cycle would change the likelihood that ash can tolerate EAB infestations?
So I think so. I mean, it does certainly give the trees a chance to defend themselves a bit more, especially during those early stage infestations. Where it gets interesting for us in Western Canada, so in the prairie provinces, so Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, is in those urban populations and in those riparian areas, you have a lot of black ash, and so and the tolerance of black ash to EAB is a lot lower than white, which I don't think we have a lot of, and green. So you have it's complicated. So yeah, the trees should be able to defend themselves, but you also have trees that aren't sort of not to be very well defended by EAB. So you got two things going on there. So it's one of those interesting questions that would be nice to look at. So.
Yeah, to add to that, Chris, I was kind of mentioning black ash as well. Black ash, as you know, like you said, does react violently towards EAB, and the defenses kind of like actually kill the tree more than actually EAB killing the tree, because black ash is apparently very similar to Siberian ash in genetic structure, and Siberian ash is known to be resistant to EAB. So maybe the 2-year cycle might work towards the advantage. Maybe it gets a second chance to kind of like, maybe it's slowing EAB, and there is a possibility there.
Yep.
So you
And-
never know. It's an interesting situation there.
Yeah,
Maybe
and
the
some of
2-year
those
cycle
communities have got
will be.
some of those communities have got Mancana ash as well, which is somewhat resistant, but then you've also got these other ash pests that are also affecting the ash trees there. So you got this interaction between ash leaf cone roller and ash psyllid and emerald ash borer in Western Canada that is kind of not been looked at. So yeah.
Yeah. So I also have a question. I don't know, maybe I should be able to look this up. Do we know what species of ash were infested in Winnipeg in the urban environment, or were there any black ashes involved, or mostly white ash?
So I
Or
think
green
we
ash?
had them all in green ash is the ones
Green
we
ash,
had.
okay.
Yeah, and that's all we've ever gotten from them is green. I think I have to double check, but I'm pretty sure they're always green. So
Okay. No, that's definitely something interesting to look at too. So thanks.
Yeah, this is fascinating stuff. Well, thank you both so much again for coming and talking for our EAB Awareness Week. Again, we have had a great series of talks. We have one more talk later on today at 3. So if you haven't registered for that, please do so. And thank you all for being here and learning more about this wild pest. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.